Hello and welcome to The Explainer. I want you to think about the last message you sent. Was it a private joke with a friend? Maybe a sensitive business deal? You hit send. You trusted it was secure. But was it? We're going to dig into that very question, using insights from a report by the tech research firm Virtualization Options LLC, which really specializes in making these complex topics clear for decision makers. Let's find out how private your messages really are.
So this is the big question, isn't it? You hit send, you assume that conversation is just between you and the person on the other end. But is that assumption actually correct? Well, the answer is way more complicated than you might think, and it's at the very heart of this huge global debate.
All right, so to even begin to understand this whole debate, we first have to get a handle on the data itself. See, when a tech company or a law enforcement agency looks at your messages, they're not just seeing one thing. They're seeing two totally different types of information. And honestly, the difference between them, it's everything.
This is probably the single most important distinction to get your head around. On one hand, you've got the content. Think of this as the actual letter you wrote, the words, the photos, the secrets. But on the other hand, you've got metadata. That's the envelope the letter came in, who sent it, who it went to, the date it was sent. It's about the message, not in the message. And as we're about to see, the law finds it way easier to look at the envelope than it does to actually open your letter.
And here's exactly why that distinction is so critical. To get the metadata, the envelope, law enforcement often just needs a subpoena. It has a lower legal bar to clear. But to get the actual content, to open the letter, they usually need a warrant, which means they have to convince a judge that there's probable cause a crime has been committed. It's a much higher hurdle. But what happens when technology makes it impossible for anyone to open that letter, even with a warrant?
And that question brings us to the great technological plot twist in this entire story: encryption. You can think of it as a digital wall that has completely changed the game, both for our privacy and for law enforcement investigations. The magic trick here is something called end-to-end encryption, or E2EE for short. The easiest way to picture it is like a magical, unbreakable locked box. When you send a message, it gets sealed inside this box, and only the person you sent it to has the key to open it. The company that delivers the box, think WhatsApp or Signal, they don't have a spare key. They can't make one. So even if a judge orders them to open that box, they physically can't.
And this technology has huge real-world consequences. Just look at this. For apps like WhatsApp and Signal that use end-to-end encryption, law enforcement cannot get your message content. Not because the companies are refusing, but because it's mathematically impossible for them to get it. They can, however, sometimes hand over metadata. And notice the difference here. Signal gives up almost nothing, just when you signed up and last connected. WhatsApp, on the other hand, can provide things like timestamps and IP addresses. This exact tension, it led to one of the biggest tech showdowns in recent history.
So this isn't just a theoretical debate. This conflict exploded into the public in a huge way, with one of the most famous legal battles of the last decade, Apple versus the FBI. This case really puts a human face on this abstract fight between security and privacy. Okay, so here's how it all went down. After the horrible attack in San Bernardino back in 2015, the FBI found one of the attacker's iPhones, but it was locked. So they got a court order telling Apple that they had to build a special piece of software, basically a backdoor, to help the FBI unlock it. And Apple's response? A very public, very firm no. This just kicked off a global firestorm. In the end, the FBI announced it had found another way in with help from a third party, and they dropped the case against Apple. But that fundamental question? It never got answered.
And Apple's argument, which we've paraphrased here, was incredibly powerful. They basically said, look, the government wants us to create a master key, a backdoor. But if we create a key for them, even for a good reason, that key can be copied, it can be stolen. It could be used by criminals or even hostile governments against every single one of our users. For them, it was a Pandora's box that they refused to open. That whole Apple versus FBI showdown, it wasn't a one-off event. It was really just the most public flashpoint in a much larger ongoing struggle. It's a really high-stakes balancing act, with deeply held and totally competing values on every side. So from law enforcement's perspective, this is all about public safety. Their argument is that very dangerous criminals are using this powerful encryption to go dark, planning terrible things right under the noses of investigators who are legally blind. For them, getting access isn't about spying on everyone.
It's about having the tools they need to stop the worst of the worst.
Now, on the other side of that coin, you have privacy advocates, and they see it completely differently. Their view is that a backdoor for one is a backdoor for all, period. They believe that strong, unbreakable encryption is essential for a free society. It protects journalists, activists, and just regular citizens from government overreach or hackers. If you weaken it for any reason, you've weakened it for everyone.
And then you have the tech industry, kind of caught right in the middle. They're trying to balance keeping their users' trust with these government demands. Their core argument is actually a technical one. You simply cannot build a key that only the good guys can use. They argue that any special access point you create for the government immediately becomes the #1 target for every bad actor on the planet, making us all less safe.
And if you're thinking, wow, this sounds really complicated, you are absolutely right. There is no simple solution here. First, the encryption itself is a wall of math. Then you have the nightmare of international jurisdictions. Is your data governed by US law or by European privacy laws where the server is? And even if you could get access, how do you build in transparency and oversight to make sure these powers aren't abused? These are massive, thorny questions with no easy answers.
So, after going through the tech, the laws, and all sides of the debate, where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us with the ultimate question of control. At the end of the day, who really gets to hold the keys to our digital lives?
Okay, let's just pull all this together. Here are the big takeaways. First, strong encryption means limited access to our message content is now a technical reality. That in turn has pushed this entire fight into the courts, which are now the main battlefield. But this is an evolving landscape. New technology and new laws are always shifting the ground beneath our feet. And ultimately, it all comes down to a delicate balance between two really important values, public safety and personal privacy, with no easy answer in sight.
Which brings us to a final question, and this one is for you to think about. In this incredibly complex world, with all these competing interests, governments, giant tech companies, privacy activists, who do you ultimately trust with your data? What trade-offs are you willing to live with? That's really the question that will define our digital future. Thanks for joining us on The Explainer.